Welcome to part 3 of module 3. This time we move from the desk to the construction site. So in step 1 we worked mainly with documents such as contracts, modifications, supplier profiles and declared subcontractors. Whereas now in step 2 we ask a simple question: does reality match that story? We stay focused on works and small infrastructure projects such as school extensions, drainage and pipes, small bridges, public squares and so on. These are exactly the projects where citizens feel the impact most when the quality is poor or when works are never finished. So in this part, every field in the reporting template tool is there to help you to spot one of our 3 corruption schemes on the ground. Corruption scheme 1 can mostly be spotted on the ground when we check whether the extra money, time or works that were added on paper cannot actually be seen and justified on site. Whereas corruption scheme 2 is usually spotted when we compare quantities, quality and payments. And lastly, corruption scheme 3 is generally spotted when we look at which company names actually appear or not on site. There's also one cross-cutting risk factor behind all of these corruption schemes: obstructed or controlled access to the site. Access denial, as mentioned, is not a corruption scheme by itself, but it often appears when there's something to hide. So in step 2 we always log when and why we're kept away. The idea is simple. Step 1 gave us the story on paper, but step 2 now gives us the story on the ground, and where those 2 stories don't match, you're very close to a serious red flag problem. Everything in step 2 starts with one practical question: were you actually able to see whether the contract is being implemented? If you could enter at least one construction or delivery site with permission, you obviously tick yes. That could be a street segment under rehabilitation, a school extension, a drainage canal, anything covered by the works contract. But if you tried and you couldn't enter, maybe the gate was locked, the contractor refused, or the contracting authority said that this is a restricted area, you tick no. Even if you collected photos from outside the fence or spoke to residents, it still counts as no access. This question is really the gateway to all field checks. So whether the answer is yes, you can directly observe quantities, quality, who's working on site, and whether modifications make sense, which all link back to where corruption scheme 1, 2 and 3 become visible. But when answering no, you cannot see the project, and that itself is a risk signal. Most small infrastructure works like paving a street, building a bus shelter or upgrading a park should be visible to all citizens. If monitors are systematically blocked, it usually means someone is nervous about what you may find. So don't underestimate this field. A clear, honest no with short explanation is already a valuable piece of information on how open or closed the project is to public scrutiny. Now, if you could visit at least one site, the tool immediately asks which site and on what date. Many projects in our focus countries are spread out: several streets, multiple school buildings, a number of drainage segments and so on. That's why the tool uses a drop-down of project sites. You pick the site that actually visited and enter the inspection date. If you checked more than one site, you need to add a separate line for each. Now, this may feel administrative, but it's actually critical for evidence. So for corruption scheme 2, it tells anyone reading the report exactly where you saw missing items or poor quality work and on which day the situation looked that way. For corruption scheme 3, this links the company logos you saw to a specific part of the project. For instance, road line SRL observed at Site 2, North Access Road, on 15th of July. Later on, auditors, journalists or other monitors can use this information to go back to the same place and see whether the situation has changed since. Good monitoring is not just about what you saw, but it's also about leaving a clear trail so that others can follow up. Now, if you couldn't carry out any site visits, we don't stop the monitoring, we document why. In this field, you simply note who blocked access. Maybe it was someone from the contracting authority, the main contractor, or even security staff, or a site supervisor. It can also be other actors, but when this happened, you need to document the date and roughly the time. What reason they gave, maybe using their own words as much as possible, so safety reasons, no authorization from City Hall, project still confidential, or even you need to talk to my boss. On its own, access denial is not corruption scheme as we've gone through many times. Sometimes there may be genuine safety or security constraints. However, from an integrity perspective, repeated or unexplained obstruction is a control weakness. It prevents independent eyes from checking quantities, quality, and who's on site. In many real cases documented by the OECD and NGOs, refusal to let monitors onto a site was later linked to serious problems with overbilling, hidden subcontractors, or even politically sensitive suppliers. So here we simply make sure that the obstruction does not disappear from the record. After logging this, you still continue with the desk-based parts of Step 2, but you treat this blocked access as an important risk signal when you interpret the rest of the project. Here you see a closed gate with a no entry style sign, machinery behind, and a monitor standing outside with a clipboard. The question is essentially, how do we interpret this? Is blocked access automatically corruption or something else? What do you think the best answer here is? Blocked access is not a corruption scheme by itself, but it is a serious control weakness and a risk signal. Remember what we said throughout Module 3. Access denial does not prove corruption scheme 1, 2, or even 3. But if monitors or ordinary citizens are systematically kept away from a small public project that should be visible, such as a playground, we should be asking why. In the iMonitor tool, this is really captured right at the start of Step 2. Were you able to carry out a site visit? Yes or no? And if no, who refused access and what reason did they give? Good practice for you as monitors is record who blocked you, contract authority, security site supervisor, so on. Record when and what they said, in their own words if possible. Then continue with the desk-based checks, but interpret all later findings with that access problem in mind. So the key takeaway here is, a closed gate is not proof of corruption, but it definitely is a clear indicator that independent checks on corruption scheme 1, 2 and 3 are being made difficult, and that's exactly why we log carefully in Step 2. Next, you'll see here that we locate the project on its timeline. So here you choose between not started, ongoing and finished. Not started when the works have not begun on the ground, ongoing when works are underway, or select finish when works are complete and formally handed over. Now this choice is important because the reporting tool shows you different follow-up questions. If the project has not been started, you'll focus on reasons for delay and whether the contract is still realistic. This often is a prelude to future corruption scheme 1 modifications. But if it's ongoing, you'll answer questions on schedule, quantities and payments, which is core territory for corruption scheme 1 and corruption scheme 2. If it's finished, you'll concentrate on what was actually delivered, so its condition and its use. Again, very relevant for corruption scheme 2. So try to base your status on the most recent evidence you have. Site observations, photos or even recent reports, not only on the planned dates in the contract. And once you have chosen the status, keep it in mind for all later answers. Don't just describe future plans as if they were already built, and make sure not to forget defects just because a final acceptance certificate exists. Here you see that we check time, not money or quantities. So look at the approved schedule. Start date, key milestones, completion date are all relevant, and compare it with what you saw or what recent reports say. Then answer, is implementation broadly following that schedule? If the answer is no, write 1 or 2 neutral sentences on what you observed. For instance, work started 3 months after the planned start date, or milestones 1 and 2 are both more than 6 weeks late. Why is this important for corruption schemes? Well, for corruption scheme 1, repeated delays often create pressure for urgent extensions and additional funds. If you've already seen significant delays, later variation orders deserve extra scrutiny. But for corruption scheme 2, extreme delays combined with high payment levels can indicate that money is going out while little is happening on the ground. Now, at this stage, you don't need to decide whether the delays are justified, maybe because of the weather, the design errors, or missing permits, but you simply just record that the project is not on track and, if possible, how far it has drifted from the original schedule. Now we look at the heart of Step 2 for works contracts. Here we're asking, are the quantities and qualities on the ground consistent with what the contract is paying for? You don't need to measure every bolt and brick. Instead, here for works, you pick up 3 representative items that are easy to see and important for citizens. For instance, number of trees, benches or light poles, or a main piece of playground equipment. For each of these, you compare 2 things. What the bill of quantities and drawings say should be there, and what you actually see on site using simple counts or rough estimates. If it's clear that there's a meaningful gap, more than 5%, you record this as a variance. The 5% threshold is there so that you ignore minor imperfections and focus on serious under-delivery. An example of this could be the bill of quantities says 100 metres of new curb, but walking the street you estimate only about 75 to 80 metres installed. Another one could be that the contract pays for 40 trees along a road, but you only count 24 or 25. Another one could even be the playground is listed as fully installed, but one of the main structures is clearly missing or even incomplete. So each of these is a textbook case of corruption scheme 2. Public money's going out as if the agreed works were there, but the site tells another story. So in your description, make sure to stay neutral and concrete. That's why this simple 3-item 5% variance check is so powerful. It anchors your analysis in visible facts on the ground. Putting this in practice, let's take a moment to look at the playground photo. Only part of the rubber safety surface has been installed. A section of the ground is also still bare and even muddy, and a swing is clearly broken and taped off, which is a clear safety hazard for children. We also see fewer benches and play structures that we would have expected. And then there's a banner on the fence proudly saying, "New playground, works 100% completed." Now the question asks, which observation is the clearest corruption scheme 2 red flag? The best answer is the one that says, in essence, the contract claims 100% completion and full payment, but on site some agreed items are missing or even defective, and the area is not safely usable. This is classic corruption scheme 2. The paper story says everything is done and paid, but the ground story shows unfinished or poor quality works, in this case also direct safety risk for children. In the reporting tool, how would you log this? Well, you'd go step 2, works delivered, quantities and quality, using the 3 items 5% variance approach. For example, you could include step 2, payments, do they match what you see? Especially if 100% payment is already certified, your language in the tool needs to stay neutral and factual, such as playground certified as 100% complete and paid, but during visit only around 70% of the safety surface was installed and 1 of 6 swings was taped off as unusable. Benches and equipment fewer than listed in the bill of quantities. Now here the learning point is that whenever 100% complete is on paper meets clearly incomplete or unsafe works on site, you are standing right inside corruption scheme 2 red flags. Now taking a look at another activity, we take exactly the same corruption scheme 2 logic but into a much more sensitive setting, a hospital ward. Looking at what this question describes, on paper we've seen that a final inspection certificate says 100% works completed. The contract and bill of quantities specify things like washable wall finishes and proper floor drainage, which are critical for infection control and cleaning. But on site you still see rough cement on wall areas and water pooling on the floor nearly draining instead of draining away. The correct answer here is option B. But why is this a clear corruption scheme 2 red flag? Well, because corruption scheme 2 is all about the gap between what was paid for and what was actually delivered. Here the hospital has been paid for and fully finished, easy to clean ward, but some of the most critical finishes are incomplete or defective. In a hospital this is not just an aesthetic issue, it affects hygiene and safety. Now if we take a look at options A and C, although they can be annoying in real life, they're not strong indicators of corruption scheme 2 evidence by themselves. A different wall colour is usually a design change, but it's not a proof of under-delivery. Whereas too cold in winter is more about building services and comfort, and needs technical checks before we can actually say anything. So in the iMonitor reporting tool, how would you log this? You'd go directly to step 2, works, quantities and quality, using the 3 items 5% variance approach. For instance, you then go to, are issued payments consistent with observed implementation? This is only if 100% payment has already been made. You would tick no and explain the mismatch. Again here, your wording needs to stay neutral and factual. For example, final certificate states 100% completion and full payment, but during visit, several wall sections remain in rough cement and floor finishes around drains show standing water rather than proper drainage, contrary to the specification. The key message that we want to give the monitors here is, corruption scheme 2 is not only about roads and playgrounds. Anytime the paper says fully completed and paid, but important technical features are missing or defective, especially in sensitive places like a hospital, you are looking at a serious corruption scheme 2 red flag. Now we bring money into the picture. Using whatever documents you can access, whether it be payment orders, invoices, progress certificates, you estimate how much of the contract value has been paid. Then what you need to do is compare that to what you observed on site and what the latest progress report says. If payments roughly match progress, you tick yes. If you cannot get access to reliable payment information, you tick can't answer and explain why. But if you tick no, you need to give a short factual description of the mismatch. For example, Payment order and progress certificates show 100% of contract value paid. Site appears approximately 70% complete, unpaved section of road and unfinished drainage. Or maybe you need to say 3 interim payments issued for full playground, but equipment for younger children missing at time of visit. This question directly targets Corruption Scheme 2. A project can have delays and even justified design changes, but when full payment is issued while large payments of the works are missing or clearly incomplete, something has gone wrong in the control chain. You still don't need to prove intent or fraud. Here your task is clearly just to document, in neutral terms, that the financial story and the physical reality are not aligned. Now in step 1 you already checked whether modifications were signed and published, but in step 2 we're looking again at their justifications, but this time with the benefit of what you saw on site. So for each modification you need to ask, is there a specific written explanation? More time, more money, extra works, and why it was necessary? Does it refer to concrete evidence like a design error, a landslide, or even unexpected utility lines? Many risk projects use vague formulas such as unforeseen circumstances or technical reasons without any real detail. Others use modifications to add works that clearly should have been in the original design, for instance basic drainage in a street project. When justifications look weak, generic or missing, you tick no or can't answer and summarise the gap in a few words. This could be modification adds new parking lot, no explanation of why not included in original design. Now this is core Corruption Scheme 1. International standards, including the OECD guidance, are clear that serious projects should not hide major changes behind empty phrases. Your neutral notes here help to show whether the project meets that expectation clearly. This question is where modifications move from the file to the ground. During your visit, note any major differences from the original design. This could be an extra parking area, a longer drainage segment, a new roundabout, or, on the contrary, parts of the design that were dropped. Then check whether there are signed price variation orders that correspond to those changes. So there are 2 main risk patterns here to look out for. Extra works on site, no variation order. Something is being built or changed, but let's say there's no formal decision or pricing. That's often used to hide favours or side deals, clearly a Corruption Scheme 1 territory indicator. Next we have variation orders on paper but no visible change on site. The contract value increases, but in reality the road, school or drainage looks the same. This combines Corruption Scheme 1 and 2 because public money may have been paid for something that doesn't actually exist. Your notes need to simply identify the mismatch. Let's say variation order 3 adds bike lane along entire street. No bike lane visible on site as of visit date. Remember, slide 2 to 5 in part 2 looked at the paper side of modifications. This slide looks at the real world slide. So when those 2 sides don't line up, you are seeing a classic pattern of unjustified scope creep, often used to mask over pricing or even incomplete works. This case study shows how good contract design can reduce the pressure that leads to the corruption schemes we've been tracking throughout public construction and small infrastructure projects. Amazon looked at its higher risk construction projects and saw a familiar problem. Contractors often have to interact with public officials to obtain permits and approvals. That's exactly where demands for bribes or even facilitation payments tend to appear. Now, instead of pretending this risk doesn't exist, Amazon wrote very clear clauses into its contracts. They do 2 main things. One being if government's permits are delayed for reasons outside the contractor's control, the contractor can ask for a deadline extension. Secondly, if the contractor or its agents are asked for an unlawful payment, they must promptly report it to Amazon. But why does this matter for our 3 corruption schemes? First, think about Corruption Scheme 1. In many public contracts, when a contractor has secretly paid a bribe to speed up its permits, they try to recover the loss later through inflated variation orders or extra time that isn't really justified. Now, Amazon's clauses give them a clean alternative. If permits are delayed, they can request a transparent, documented deadline extension without actually paying anyone. That reduces the incentive to hide extra costs inside dubious modifications. In other words, good anti-bribery language helps prevent the kind of fake or exaggerated variations that we've been flagging in Corruption Scheme 1. Secondly, linking this to Corruption Scheme 2. So when contractors are squeezed with bribe demands and don't have any protection, they often cope by cutting corners. This could be thinner tarmac, weaker concrete, fewer items installed, but invoices still at 100%. By protecting honest contractors who refuse bribes and allowing them more time instead of forcing them to fix the problem with money, these clauses reduce the financial pressure to compensate through poor quality work. So indirectly, they actually lower the risk that we'll later find missing quantities or substandard works under Corruption Scheme 2. Thirdly, considering Corruption Scheme 3, in some systems, bribes are actually routed through friendly consultants or even shell subcontractors whose only real job is to handle permits. Now, they appear briefly in the contract chain, invoice something vague, or they may even disappear. But if contractors have to report the bribe requests and know that they can actually get timetable relief instead, there is less need to create those fake or unnecessary subcontracting chains. That means fewer shell companies being used to disguise illicit payments, exactly the pattern we track under Corruption Scheme 3. Now, of course, you as civic monitors are not drafting Amazon-style contracts, but this example is useful for our work in two ways. It shows that serious buyers, whether public or private, recognise the same pressure points we've been talking about and try to manage them through clear rules. It also reminds us that when we see strange modifications, sudden subcontractors, or even unexplained quality problems in a local road, drainage project, or even a school extension, these all may be symptoms of deeper issues like bribe demands about permits and approvals. So you can think of this slide as an upstream side of our corruption schemes. Strong anti-bribery clauses, like Amazon's, try to prevent the need for Corruption Scheme 1, 2 and 3 in the first place. Your job, however, using the iMonitor tool in Step 2, is to check the downstream side. So in real public contracts, did modifications, delivery and subcontracting actually stay within a clean, transparent pattern, or do you see the kind of symptoms that suggest those pressures were handled the wrong way? This part of the template asks whether other key contract provisions are being respected. For works, the most important one is usually supervision. Most construction contracts require an assigned supervisor from the contracting authority and sometimes a separate works supervision company or even an environmental supervisor. But your job is to check whether these supervisors are real and active or just names on paper. So here you need to look for who signs the progress reports and payment orders. Is it the named supervisor or somebody else? Whether there's actually evidence of regular visits, could be dated site notes, inspection reports, photos spread over the implementation period. But if a supervision company is named, and whether you actually see their logo on site or on reports is important as well. So when you see no signatures from the supervisor, only one report at the very end, or the reports that look copy-pasted, you describe this briefly. This is a control weakness that affects all three schemes. For Corruption Scheme 2, weak supervision makes it easy to pour less concrete, use thin tarmac, skip drainage, or plant fewer trees while still getting paid. Whereas for Corruption Scheme 3, a sleeping supervisor will not notice unlisted subcontractors actually doing the work. And for Corruption Scheme 1, supervisors may sign off on large modifications without even verifying whether the extra works were really needed or carried out. So you're not judging individual professionals here, you're just documenting whether the control system that should protect public money is actually functioning. This is the field twin of the subcontracting checks we did in Step 1. On paper we saw who is supposed to be doing the works, whereas now in Step 2 we're asking who is actually on site. Treat this as a logo hunt. While walking the site, carefully look for company names on excavators, trucks and small machinery, logos on high-vis vests, jackets and helmets, names on containers, office cabins and the site information board. Then compare these names with the supplier and subcontractor listed in the contract. If they match, you tick yes. If you see company names that are not listed anywhere, you tick no and list them. Exact name, where you saw it, and when. So for example, Roadline SRL, logo on tarmac truck and workers PPE at North Entrance observed. 8th of May 2026, 14:30, photos attached. Now, if you really cannot read the names or see any identifiers, you use can't answer and explain why. Extra unlisted firms on site are a classic signal for Corruption Scheme 3. Front companies winning the tender and handing the job to others or politically connected firms working without proper approval. This field can also support Corruption Scheme 2. If later the road crumbles or the drainage fails, you know which hidden company was actually on site. It's much easier to understand where the quality problem came from. And if those mystery companies belong to local officials or to the project designer, the same observations feed into conflict of interest concerns. Again, you don't need to label anything as illegal, you just need to make sure that the gap between declared and observed implementators are clearly recorded. Now, looking at it in practice, this question brings us back to Corruption Scheme 3, but this time in a local flood drainage project. The setup is very simple. On paper, the contract for the stormwater channel in Valverde says main contractor, Aquaverde SRL, and no subcontractors authorised. On site, however, as you can see in the photo here, every visible identifier belongs to another company. Excavators, trucks and vests all show Fiume and Figley SNC, and residents say that they're the ones actually doing the work on site. So the question here is, how should monitors treat this? The best answer would be B. Record Fiume and Figley SNC as an unlisted implementer with date, place and photos, and treat it as a potential corruption scheme 3 red flag. But why not A? Well, because the fact that subcontracting is forbidden on paper actually makes the situation more suspicious, not less. So if a completely different firm appears on site, it may be working informally or through some hidden arrangement. And why not C? Well, because monitors must stay neutral and factual. At this stage, you don't actually know yet whether there's a formal joint venture agreement, an emergency hire, or even a breach of the rules. So jumping straight to the words like illegal and naming individuals would go much beyond your role. This could inevitably lead to accusing the mayor of corruption, which is not what we want. So in the iMonitor tool, first you need to go to step 1B, subcontracting, answer yes to unlisted implementers, and enter the name, the where, the date, evidence, and then move to step 2, declared versus observed implementers, where you would tick no and again write a short neutral note that the company on site does not actually match the contracting documents. Good neutral wording could look like contract dossier lists Aquaverde SRL as contractor, no subcontractors authorised. During visit, all machinery and PPE on site displayed the name Fiume and Figley SNC. No Aquaverde identifiers observed. Residents reported that Fiume and Figley are carrying out the works. Photos attached. So the key message is that when the company actually building a small public project is different from the one named in the contract, especially where subcontracting is not allowed on paper, you're clearly looking at strong corruption scheme 3 red flags. Your job here is to document that gap carefully, not to jump to accusations. For projects marked as finished, step 2 gives you one last set of questions. First, you need to check whether the supplier fully delivered what the contract promised. Are all main features there? Check whether the full length of the footpath, all bus shelters, all playground elements, the complete drainage network are consistent, or are some clearly missing. Secondly, you need to assess whether the works are still in an acceptable condition, especially if your visit takes place some months after completion. So are pavements already cracking, manhole covers sinking, benches broken, or newly planted trees dead? Thirdly, you need to ask whether the project is fully operational. Is the street open and safely usable for citizens? Is the renovated school building actually in use? And does the drainage canal properly carry water away during rain? When your answer is no, describe a few concrete examples. For instance, 2 of 4 planned bus shelters missing at time of visit, foundations only. Now, these findings mainly reflect corruption scheme 2. The contract can look perfect on paper, but if the works are missing or quickly fall apart in months to come, citizens are not getting what was paid for. In some cases, problems with finished works also point back to corruption scheme 1. For example, when expensive modifications were justified as improving durability, yet the upgraded road still fails early. Your careful notes here help reconstruct the story. The last step in the template is about backing up all of your answers with evidence. First, you can see here that you need to indicate which methods you actually used. This could include site inspection, document review, web research, and interviews. This helps readers understand how strong your observations actually are. Then you use the upload fields to attach key documents and visuals. The main contract pages need to come up here showing scope, contract value, and duration. This includes any addenda or variation orders, as well as selected progress reports and payment orders, but most importantly, photos or short videos from the site if you have them. For each file, please try to include a short caption that answers 4 questions. What is shown, the where, the when, and the who, but this part is only important if such a name of a company is appearing on a truck. So these uploads are what transforms your report from opinion into a checkable record. They support all 3 corruption schemes. Documents and photos of missing work support corruption scheme 2, whereas variation orders and progress reports link back to corruption scheme 1 analysis, and images of mystery companies on site support corruption scheme 3. So here you see that good evidence also protects you as a monitor. You're not making accusations, you're simply showing what the documents say and what the site looks like. Imagine your monitoring group can only visit one project this week. On the slide you see 3 new small public works scenes. On the left, a new pedestrian bridge over a stream is officially marked as completed, but when you get a closer look, you see cracks already appearing in the concrete walking surface. One section of guardrail is also missing near the middle of the bridge. Then if you take a look at the middle, a local health clinic has a brand new access ramp for patients, but the ramp looks very steep and there's no handrail. Water also collects at the bottom of the rain after the rain. The works here have been certified as finished and 100% paid. And lastly, if you take a look at the right, a village market is being renovated. The site information board names a main contractor and states no subcontractors allowed. But all vehicles and workers' vests on the roof carry a different name and logo, Mercado Velox SNC, which is not mentioned in the contract dossier at all. So the question here is, which of these 3 projects would you prioritise for a field visit and why? There's no single correct answer. You can choose A, B or C, but what matters here is that how you link your choice to the 3 corruption schemes that we've gone through throughout all of Module 3. Let's quickly connect each scene to the schemes. Scene A mainly links to corruption scheme 2, substandard works and possible safety problems on an asset that should already serve pedestrians. So if there were many contract changes behind the bridge, there could also be a link here to corruption scheme 1. Then taking a look at the health clinic ramp, again very strong corruption scheme 2 link. The ramp is supposed to provide safe access, but the design and quality clearly don't meet that purpose. It's too steep, there's no handrail, and there's also a risk of water pooling. This is also a public health and safety concern, which may indeed be considered a high priority visit. And lastly, the village market roof is a classic corruption scheme 3 pattern. The company doing the work on site, Mercado Velox SNC, does not match the contractor listed on the board and in the paperwork. This could point to hidden subcontracting, front companies, or even political connections behind market renovation. Take a moment to consider which one is your preference. Some of you may pick Scene B because of unsafe access to a clinic because this directly affects vulnerable patients. But you also might choose Scene A because the bridge combines visible structural problems with an asset that everyone uses. Now, there still may be some of you that select Scene C because unexplained companies on site could reveal a wider corruption scheme 3 network affecting several contracts, not just this one. In the iMonitor tool, all 3 scenes would be logged in slightly different places. Scenes A and B would mainly go in Step 2, quantities and quality versus payments, using the 3 items more than 5% variance logic and the question on whether works are unusable and safe. Scene C would trigger Step 1B, which refers to subcontracting, and Step 2, declared versus observed implementers, where you record that Mercado Velox SNC appears on site vehicles and vests even though the main contractor lists with no subcontractors. So the key message here is you'll never have time to chase every red flag. The iMonitor tool helps you document them consistently, and then you or your organisation decide which ones to follow up first based on impact and feasibility. Thank you for staying with me through Part 3 of Module 3. In this session, we finally stepped out of the file room and onto the construction site. Our main goal was simple, to see whether the paper trail holds up when you stand in front of the road, the square, or the school building. Now, we did this by walking through the Step 2 works fields of the reporting template, always with our 3 corruption schemes in mind. Firstly, we looked at access and status. You saw how the very first Step 2 questions ask, were you able to carry out a site visit, and what is the implementation status? Not started, ongoing, or finished. Now, that might sound basic, but it does 2 important things here. It forces us to log any access obstruction, so who refused entry on which day and why, which isn't a corruption scheme by itself, but it definitely is in construction projects that often are a sign that someone is uncomfortable with outside eyes on corruption scheme 1, 2, or 3 problems. And this further gives us a timestamp. So are we looking at a work site in progress or at a finished small infrastructure asset that should already be serving people? Secondly, we looked at delays, quantities and qualities through the lens of corruption scheme 2. So for ongoing works, you use the fields on whether implementation is following the planned schedule and whether the quantities and qualities you see match what is written in the contract, the bill of quantities and the progress reports. We focused especially on the 3 items more than 5% variance rule. Instead of trying to measure everything, you pick a few very visible items, playground equipment, benches and trees, just to name a few, and ask, is there a clear gap between what should be here and what is actually on the ground. So whenever that gap is large and the invoices show that the work has already been paid for, you are right inside Corruption Scheme 2. Third, we connected this to the money trail. The question on payments versus observed implementation helps you compare payment orders and progress certificates with what you physically see. If 100% of a small bridge rehabilitation has been paid, but only half of the deck is actually finished, you don't need to speculate about motives. You simply describe the mismatch, paid versus built. This turns Corruption Scheme 2 from a vague suspicion into a clear documented discrepancy that auditors or journalists can follow up on later. Fourth, we brought contract modifications back into the picture, but now from the field side. In Part 2, we checked whether modifications were properly signed, published, and justified on paper, whereas here in Part 3, you used the Step 2 questions to ask, do the on-site changes correspond to the signed, priced variation orders approved by the buyer? And that's where Corruption Scheme 1 meets reality. You learned to flag extra works that you can see on site that are not actually covered by any variation order, and to spot priced modifications on paper that never materialised on the ground. So in small infrastructure projects, this could look like a new parking area that only exists in the documents, or a design correction that produces very little real improvement but adds months of money. When the sites and the variation orders don't line up, Corruption Scheme 1 and 2 usually travel together. Fifth, we focused on who's actually doing the work. Corruption Scheme 3 on the ground. You use the Step 2 field on company identifiers on site to compare the supplier and subcontractors listed in the contract with that of the logos and the names you see on machinery, trucks, PPE, and site boards. So if everything matches, that's reassuring. But if new names appear that never went through the original selection procedure, you're clearly seeing Corruption Scheme 3, irregular or phantom subcontracting. In a small drain project, this might be a politically connected company that suddenly appears during the excavation, even though another firm won the tender. Now, by listing the company name, where you saw it, and the date and time, you learned how to turn that observation into evidence that others can recheck. Sixth, we touched on supervision and other contract provisions. The template asked whether other contract obligations are being respected and whether the named supervisor is actually present in the paperwork and on site. Weak or symbolic supervision is not a separate scheme, as we mentioned, but it is a control weakness that makes all three schemes easier. It allows unjustified modifications to pass unchecked, it allows substandard materials and missing items to be certified as complete, and it even allows phantom subcontractors to work in plain sight. So your neutral tones, who signs reports and how often they visit help show whether the safety belt of the project is tight or loose. Finally, we close the loop with evidence. The last fields in Step 2 remind you to record your methods, whether it be site inspection, web research, or interviews, and to upload contracts, addenda, photos, and other files with short descriptions of the what, where, when, and who. This is where your observations become part of the broader anti-corruption effort. It ensures that everything you've documented on access quantities, payments, modifications, and company logos can be checked later by someone who's never on the site. So, if we condense Part 3 into 3 guiding questions for you to take away for the field visit. 1. Do the works we see match the scope, quantities, schedule, and modifications approved on paper, mainly Corruption Scheme 1 and 2? And do the companies on site match ones in the contract, Corruption Scheme 3, and sometimes conflict of interest here issues behind all 3 schemes? And lastly, is anyone actually supervising, and are access and controls functioning? The conditions that make corruption schemes either easier or difficult, depending. Now, in Module 3, Part 4, we will stay with the same reporting logic but look at how similar checks could be applied to goods and service contracts as hypothetical add-ons to the template, how to think about acceptance notes, timesheets, and even who really carried out consultancy or supervision works. Thank you for completing Part 3 of Module 3.